My name is Randy Hanning. I'm the leader of the Faith at Work ministry, and really excited to have you back. It's been 2 years since we had our last Faith at Work ministry meeting. Before I kind of get into a little bit of the history of this group and introduce our speaker, I'd like to invite Deacon Mike to come and open us in prayer, and then we'll get started.
Thank you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord God, we give you all praise and glory and honor and our thanks, our sense of gratitude for all that you have done for us, the fact that we are here, that we're able to come together and gather in your name to seek your purpose in our lives, to be able to ask you as your community of believers for the courage to live the life that you've called us to. Open our hearts and our minds to the promptings of your Spirit. Pour out your Spirit upon us and grant us a life that seeks greatness while remaining humble. Father, we ask that you bless our speaker this evening. May his words be your message of inspiration and encouragement and a light in these times of darkness. And so together we pray, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
So thanks for being here. And before I forget, I want to thank our volunteer who was pressed into service tonight, John Gordon. Thank you for helping us with book sales tonight. We're grateful. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to take a few minutes and maybe for the first time tell some of you about the history of the Faith at Work ministry. This ministry has actually been around since 2006. It used to be called the St. Peter Chanel Business Association. And many of you know Jim Shippers, who's a longtime parishioner at St. Peter Chanel. He founded it. I got involved with him, as did Deacon Mike, and over time it morphed into the Faith at Work ministry. And our purpose is to help Catholic men and women in the business world lead Christ-centered lives at work. It's very simple, and one of the ways that we do it is we have a very vibrant speaker series. So tonight is the first of what will be, I believe, 8 or 9 months in a row. The second Tuesday of every month, we will have a speaker. Next month, on October 12th, we have Father Paul Porter, who's a priest in this parish, and he's going to talk about the nobility of leisure, and he's going to talk about the works of Joseph Pieper. So you'll get an announcement about that. We hope that you'll attend that event as well. So I'd like to talk a little bit about our speaker, Joseph Pearce. And his talk tonight is a call to Catholic responsibility in today's world. I've had the privilege of knowing Joseph for, I believe, 11 years, maybe 12. He's been a good friend and just someone whose friendship Deacon Mike and I value. And he's a good man and just a stalwart in the Catholic Church and a great speaker and a phenomenal author. Please visit his book table before you leave tonight. He's got books and CDs and other things for sale, and you should take advantage of that. But wonderful, wonderful Catholic that you should follow, and I'll tell you about his website in a minute and some places that you can track his writing and some of his work. Joseph Pearce is a native of England. He is the internationally acclaimed author of a number of books, which include bestsellers such as The Quest for Shakespeare, Tolkien, Man and Myth, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde, C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church, Literary Converts, one of my personal favorites, Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton, Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile, and Old Thunder, A Life of Hilaire Belloc. His books have been published and translated into Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, Italian, Korean, Mandarin, Croatian, and Polish. He hosted 2 13-part television series about Shakespeare on EWTN and has also written and presented documentaries on EWTN on the Catholicism of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He has participated and lectured at a wide variety of international and literary events at major colleges and universities in the U.S., Canada, Britain, Europe, Africa, and South America. Joseph is also the director of book publishing at the Augustine Institute, editor of the St. Austin Review. By the way, please visit that website, staustinreview.org. Phenomenal literary magazine. We were talking about it at dinner. Just a one-of-a-kind type publication. You should all subscribe to it. He's the series editor of the Ignatius Critical Editions, the senior instructor with Homeschool Connections, and a senior contributor at the Imaginative Conservative. And you can follow Joseph and his work at his personal website, which is jpearce.co, jpearce.co. You can follow him, you can subscribe to his newsletter, and just be up to speed on anything that he's working on or doing. And I believe he'll tell you about 2 exciting books he's got coming out in November. So without further ado, I'd like us to welcome our friend Joseph Pearce.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Is this microphone working? It sounds as though it is. I kept trying not to cough or make a noise because I turned it on a few minutes ago, so I've been behaving myself. But that's all finished now. So it's good to be back. I think it's been about 3 years since the last time I was here that Randy has brought me back on several occasions. He's a sucker for punishment, and if any of you have been here before, you must be as well. So we're going to be talking about the moral responsibility of Catholics in today's world and the challenges of today's world. And we're going to look at what today's world is in the light of truth, in the light of that which is timeless. So that which is timeless is always timely. That's the paradox. Something that's timeless is always relevant to every generation, regardless of the culture and the time. So I'm going to begin with some words which I'm sure many of you will know, that I am the King's good servant, but God's first. And these words were said, of course, by St. Thomas More. And one we have to realize, if we sort of incline to believe that things are much worse now than they've ever been, that's simply because we actually do not know much about the history of the church and indeed the history of the world. So when those words were written, St. Thomas More basically was saying that if you force me to choose between being the king's good servant, in other words, a loyal subject to the state, and the king, by the way, here can stand in for the federal government, in other words, the secular power, if you force me to choose between being the king's good servant and God's good servant, I will choose to be God's good servant, irrespective of the personal cost to me. Now, in the case of St. Thomas More, the personal cost was years in prison, his family property being stolen from him, his own family members being effectively impoverished, and finally being beheaded. And it was a great deal, because now he's in heaven. Again, St. John Fisher was beheaded at about the same time. He was the only one of the Catholic bishops to have the courage to stand up to King Henry VIII. And what was King Henry VIII doing, by the way? He was setting up a state religion. He was saying basically that the church was under his own personal authority, under the authority of the state. So this is something which is a perennial problem that goes throughout the whole of history. So what I want to show is that these words spoken almost 600 years ago, no, almost 500 years ago. I do literature because I can't do math. So these words spoken almost 500 years ago are as relevant today as they were then. They teach us what we have to do with our responsibilities as followers of Christ and as citizens and US citizens in the 21st century. So the question is, what can history tell us about living our lives today? And the important thing is that history is in some sense synonymous with democracy. And that might be counterintuitive, but G.K. Chesterton said that tradition is the extension of the franchise. It is the democracy of the dead. It is the proxy of the dead and the enfranchisement of the unborn. In other words, when we're called to love our neighbor, we are called to love all our neighbors, including those that lived in the past. And in the cancel culture in which we live today, the past is looked down upon as being something inferior. If you come from the past, you are a member of an inferior race. There is an equivalence in the cancel culture and racism to look down our noses at the people who came before us on the assumption, of course, we're smarter than they were. Why? Because we were born later than they were. And there's no wisdom that's accumulated over the thousands of years of human history that has anything to contribute to the 21st century. In this sense, the progressives can be seen as tyrants. As G.K. Chesterton said, the modern man is like a supercilious cad who kicks down the ladder by which he's climbed. And the Catholic convert poet Roy Campbell used a metaphor about the modern world, which he likened to a car. And he said that human society is like a car. The steering wheel is wisdom. The brakes are tradition. And the accelerator is progress. He says we live in a society that has thrown away the steering wheel, refuses to use the brakes, and has got its foot down as hard as possible on the accelerator. And we know where that's ending. The thing about the history is that it has written the present. In other words, where we are now is a direct consequence of where we have been. History has written our past, as it's written the past of human society, and it will write the future. Chesterton says that the future is attractive to a certain type of person, the progressive type, because it's a blank wall, which hasn't happened yet, which means they can then write all of their own ideological ideas on it and make the future what they want it to be, which is, of course, a fantasy. The past, on the other hand, is full of all sorts of writing already. If you look at the wall, which is the past, you're facing Homer, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, Dante, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, etc., etc. The past is a challenge because the past is full of wisdom, the wisdom born of thousands of years of accumulated experience. It questions our own prejudices and our own presumptions. Understanding history is to be in communion with humanity. It's to love our neighbors in all times, including the unborn. So very briefly, I'm going to look at the perennial fabric of history. So a book I'm writing at the moment, I've given the title of The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful, History in Three Dimensions. And it was inspired by some words of Pope Benedict XVI, when he said that ultimately the only argument for the Catholic Church are the great saints and the great works of art that she's inspired. It's 2,000 years of saints and 2,000 years of beauty. And against that, we have the darkness. We have the evil in every century. So I'm going to very quickly go through history, and then we're going to look at some of the principles that allow us to understand our own time from the perspective of all time, and indeed of that which is beyond all time, eternity. But let's go back, not just to Thomas More 5 centuries ago, but to the writer Sophocles, 25 centuries ago, almost. And he wrote a play called Antigone. It's obviously before the time of Christ, but the situation is there's a war. Some things never change. And Antigone's brothers fought on two opposite sides in the war. So the king says that one brother, the one who fought on the king's side, will have a full military funeral with all pomp and circumstance. But the other one, because he's a traitor, will not be buried at all. He will have no religious funeral, and he will be left out for the birds and the dogs to devour. Now, Antigone says that the king has no right to decide who can have a religious funeral. That religious liberty is something over which the king has no authority. So she breaks the law and gives her brother a religious funeral, and in consequence is killed. Similar to St. Thomas More. Someone like William Shakespeare, I've done an awful lot of work on showing Shakespeare's Catholicism, lived in a time when it was illegal to practice the Catholic religion, where it was punishable by death to be a priest, and punishable by death to hide a priest from the authorities. In England, priests were put to death for a period of 150 years, from the time of St. Thomas More in the 1530s until the 1680s. And even after that, there were a further 150 years of persecution through the law. Catholics had very limited political rights. They couldn't stand for parliament, they couldn't vote, they had certain limited property rights. Catholic emancipation didn't happen until 1829 in England. Now, against this, we also have this wonderful tradition of Catholic social teaching, which I would recommend to you, because I don't have time to go into that tonight. But the Church, through some wonderful popes, has given us an understanding of our responsibility as Christians within political society. So, most notably, in 1891, Pope Leo XIII produced an encyclical called Rerum Novarum on new ways, which looked at the danger of industrial capitalism and also the danger of socialism, basically saying that what was necessary for the healthy society, apart from obviously worshipping Jesus Christ, was the healthy family. The family is the basis of all healthy society. If you dissolve the family, you dissolve society. Pius XI, in 1931, published an encyclical called Quadragesimo Anno, which means on the 40th anniversary, the 40th year of the previous one I mentioned, Rerum Novarum Leo XIII. He published a new one, 1931, basically re-emphasizing the Church's teaching on politics and economics. And this, of course, 1931. By this time, you had, in the 40 years, when Leo XIII had warned of the dangers of socialism, 40 years later, in 1931, we'd had the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1917, we'd had the takeover of Italy by Mussolini's fascists in 1921, and the rise of the Nazi Party. Actually, that was 2 years still in the future, 1933. But the Nazis were certainly a rising force in Germany. And then in 1991, St. John Paul II published an encyclical called Centesimus Annus on the centenary of Rerum Novarum. And if you really want to know what the Church teaches as regards what we as Christians need to be doing with the politics of our day, the sort of political society that we should be moving and working towards, read those 3 encyclicals. All right, but now I'm going to start asking some really basic questions, because if you want to know about history, you have to know ultimately that history is his story. that God, if you like, is the storyteller. He enters the story. And the Catholic Church is his mystical body in history since he entered the story. So let's say a little bit about to understanding who and what God is, because this will help us to understand who and what we are and who and what human society is, because the fabric of human society is human. It's not a machine, it's not a mechanism. Well, we know the three divine attributes of God, the three most often cited: omnipotence, he's all-powerful; omniscience, he's all-knowing; and omnipresence, he's all-present. Now, it's omnipresence, I think, is the key for us to understand history. Because when we think of God's omnipresence, we normally think, well, God's present everywhere. He's on my head, he's under the table, he's behind the doors, etc. And that's all absolutely true. But on a deeper level, what God's omnipresence means is that everything is present to God. There is no past, and there is no future for God. All of human history takes place in his presence. Now, if you understand that, then all of the anxiety we feel about the wickedness of human history, the wickedness of the human present, and the wickedness of, no doubt, of the human future, should be put in their place. So that's who God is. Who are we? Because you want to know what human society is and human politics are, human economics are, human history is. It's best to know what a human is. Well, I'll tell you what we're not, first of all. We're not the label that the modern world has appended to us for the last 200 years. And that's the word Homo Sapiens, the scientific label that the scientific people have given to us. Very modern word. The earliest known use of it was the early 1800s. But Homo Sapiens, of course, is a very stupid label for us because it means wise man. And if you know anything about human history, you know that the reason that every generation makes a mess of everything is because every generation refuses to learn the lessons of the previous generation. We all start from scratch making the same mistakes our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers made. We refuse to learn from experience, from wisdom. If there's one thing that does not define the human species as a whole, it's wisdom, Homo Sapiens. The other thing we're not, is a more modern word for this, is Homo economicus. That basically we only exist to make money and spend it. If you want to know who we are, we have to go back to older understandings of who we are. The Greek word for man is anthropos, where we get words like anthropology. Anthropos, according to Plato, and he's a good enough authority for me on the Greek language. Anthropos means he who turns upwards, or he who looks upwards. And the way I sometimes try to explain this is that the animal grazes, but man gazes. That the animal is a slave to instinct, does what it's designed to do only. But we do not only see by the light of the sun, as do the animals. We know that we see by the light of the sun, which the animals do not. We can look at the sun and work out how far it is from us. We can look at the sun and see how long it takes light to reach us. We can look at the sun and have a fairly good idea how hot it is, and perhaps how far it is from other suns. We can even write a sonnet to the sun. And I'm going back to the Catholic convert poet Roy Campbell. He wrote a sonnet called To the Sun, part of which goes as follows. "Oh, let your shining orb grow dim of Christ the mirror and the shield, that I may gaze through you to him, see half the miracle revealed." The whole idea of God's creation not merely being something which is physical, but metaphysical, something which contains the beauty of God himself as the creator. As Gerald Manley Hopkins said, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. So I'm going to talk about probably the preeminent Catholic philosopher of all time, the angelic doctor, is St. Thomas Aquinas. And he will show you how anthropos, he who looks up, is the very core of who we are, or at least who we are meant to be, because we'll see there's other aspects of who we are we'll come to in a moment. He says basically in the Summa that perception, understanding reality, including the reality around us today in our society, depends first of all on virtue, specifically the virtue of humility. Because he says if we have humility, we will have the fruit of humility, which is gratitude. And if we have a sense of gratitude, our eyes will be opened in wonder. And if our eyes are opened in wonder, we'll be moved to contemplation. And it's only through contemplation that we reach, in Latin, the dilatatio, dilation, the opening of the mind into the fullness of the real. So fivefold, 5 senses, 5 modes of perception: humility, gratitude, wonder, contemplation, dilation. Thomas Aquinas. What happens if the first part doesn't exist? Well, the definition of the absence of humility is pride. And again, sin does not have a reality. It's the absence of a reality. It's the absence of the truth and light of God. It's turning our back on it. It's preferring the darkness and the shadow to the fullness of God's presence. So if we have the absence of humility, pride, we will not have a sense of gratitude. We will be ungrateful. And if we're ungrateful, our eyes will not be open in wonder. They'll be tight shut in cynicism. And if they're tight shut in cynicism, we will not be moved to contemplation of the deeper things. We'll merely dismiss them as not existing. And instead of our mind dilating, opening out into the fullness of reality, it will shrivel and shrink into a wreckage. And for me, the most realistic depiction of the human soul that has succumbed to this addiction of pride and the cynicism which is its cankered fruit is Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, who's no longer the good hobbit he is made to be. He's a shriveled wreck who prefers the darkness and is addicted to his sin. Well, then the name for that in Latin, the person who will not look up in wonder, who refuses the call to be anthropos, is Homo Superbus, proud man, the sin of superbia. So anthropos versus Homo Superbus, but there's another aspect of who we are, and this is very important to our understanding of our own times and all times, history and the future, and how we should respond to the crises and challenges of our own particular time. And that is, we are also Homo viator in Latin, which is we are man on a pilgrimage, man on a quest, on a journey, on an adventure. Chesterton said that an adventure is an inconvenience rightly considered. And an inconvenience is an adventure wrongly considered. Are our eyes open in wonder, or are they closed shut in cynicism to the life we find ourselves living? Because the only purpose of life is the journey to God. We are all on that journey. And it's the only goal of life. And if we fail, we are literally miserable losers. We have failed to do the only thing we're here for. So Homo sapiens, no. Homo economicus, no. Anthropos, yes. Homo viator, yes. Homo superbus, yes. When we understand that threefold nature of who we are, he who looks up in wonder, he who's on the journey to God, or he who refuses the journey through pride, refuses to look up to heaven, then we can make sense of our time and all time and know how to respond. The first thing we'll realize, by the way, is we mustn't fall into the progressive trap or the regressive trap, the anti-progressive trap, of believing in a golden age, at least not in time. So the progressives believe that things are just getting better and better because that's the way that the blind material machine of history works. It just gets better anyway. They don't believe anyone designed the machine, but as if by magic, things always get better. And so therefore, the future is always going to be better than the past. That's why you don't have to listen to the past. That's why you can cancel the past and worship a future that's not happened yet in the faith that it will. This belief in the golden age was believed by the people who were the designers of the French Revolution. And within months of the French Revolution being victorious, they'd invented a weapon of mass destruction for the killing of civilians called the guillotine. And what followed straight after the revolution, where they set up the goddess Reason in the place of the Blessed Virgin in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and they went back to year one. This is where the Golden Age begins, where the Golden Age began and ended in the reign of terror. It began by killing the rich and the priests and the religious, and ended up killing each other. Undaunted, out of the French Revolution, the socialists arose, and the Bolshevik Revolution, exactly the same thing. The Golden Age being ushered in by revolution. Or the Nazis. Hitler spoke of a 1,000-year Reich, 1,000-year Aryan civilization that would dwarf the Roman Empire and the Greeks and any other empire in history. Of course, it doesn't really matter if you exterminate the Jews, because that's only one generation. You're talking about 1,000 years. Your imaginary history, which lasted 12 years of bloodshed. By the most conservative estimate, this belief in a golden age in the future, these utopian politics, have killed at least 60 million people in the past century. A conservative estimate, most of them civilians, most of them by their own government. But nor is there a golden age in the past. So we can all be saying smugly, yeah, well, that's so much for their golden age. We've seen it all before. It's just going to end up being a miserable age of terror again, which, because we're not Homo sapiens, we won't learn from, and 50 years later we'll do it all over again. If you want to see a golden age, let's look to the past. And we can be inspired, as Pope Benedict quite rightly says, by Chartres Cathedral or the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, or great works of art, and see that the age that they came from, what an age of beauty that was. But the very age of the High Middle Ages, where you had cathedrals being built and great poets like Dante and Chaucer writing profoundly Christian works, was an age when there were 3 people claiming to be Pope at the same time, where the Pope himself was exiled from Rome. There was a false Pope in Rome And the real Pope is exiled to Avignon in France. So the book I'm writing at the moment, the design of it is to have a separate chapter for every century since the time of Christ. So 20 centuries, 20 chapters. And every chapter is going to have about 1,000 words on the good, in other words, on love, on the saints, on sanctity, 1,000 words on the bad, secular politics, wickedness, the Judas figures within the church, and 1,000 words on the beautiful works of art that Christ has inspired in his followers. And what we'll see when we see that is a tapestry, whereas every generation, this pattern of the three is being played out. But it's being played out where? Well, from our perspective, a very limited perspective, it's being played out in time. It's being played out ultimately in God's presence. Progress, and the only progress that matters, is moving towards the center of history, who is Jesus Christ. Moving towards the ever-presence, from the present to the ever-present. To understand that heroism and holiness are ultimately the same thing. To understand that sanity and sanctity are ultimately the same thing. So where are we in all this? Are we sort of stuck in tens of thousands of years of human history, human misery, the same mistakes, the same evil, with the same saints, as if you like candles in the darkness that we can be inspired by and perhaps even try to become ourselves? Well, no. We are soldiers on active service for a very short period of time. Because let's remind ourselves now, we've talked about who God is in order to understand the times in which we live, and indeed all times in which all of us live. And we've looked at who we are as human persons. But let's look at who the church is. Because the church is the mystical body of Jesus Christ. And the church exists simultaneously in three forms, only one of which is permanent. The other two are passing away. There's the church triumphant in heaven. That's the permanent church in glory, in the presence of Jesus Christ. There's the church suffering, the church in purgatory, the holy souls who have lived a sinful life but died repentant, and by the mercy of God are on that homo viator, that journey to heaven. Purgatory, of course, is a one-way street. If you get there, there's only one destination. In some ways, that's why Dante places St. Peter's Gate halfway up Mount Purgatory, because purgatory is the entrance to heaven. If you get to purgatory, you're in heaven, just being washed clean, so that you can go further up and further in, as C.S. Lewis would say. And then there's the Church Militant, the church in time. This is the church's teaching, by the way. It's not a Joseph Pearce theory. This is the teaching of the church, that we are members of the Church Militant. We are members of the church at war with the powers of darkness. And the prince of this world is not Jesus Christ. The prince of this world is the enemy of Jesus Christ. And the name Satan in Hebrew means enemy or adversary. And thanks be to God, we only have very limited terms of active service as soldiers of Christ. Tolkien said that as a Christian, I see history as the long defeat with only occasional glimpses of final victory. That every age is the people that want power are the people that we shouldn't really want to have it, and yet they're the people that invariably do have it. It's the worldly that rule the world, which is why more often than not the saints are being put to death. So, all of us should be keeping our eye on the finishing line when our tour of active duty is ended, and if we are good and heroic soldiers for Christ, we enter into his presence on a much deeper level than we are here. Because one thing that's very different from the way that we understand reality, from the way that the pagans understood reality, there's a great deal of truth in the classical epics and the tragedies of the Greeks. I mentioned Antigone. You can see the perennial truth in that story. But they believed that when we die, we become mere shadows of our former selves. That this is the real world, where we have flesh and blood, where we're fully real. When we die, we don't cease to exist, but we become less real. We become literally mere shadows of our former selves. This is the real world. The afterlife is the shadowland. And C.S. Lewis says, but for a Christian, it's entirely the other way around. That this is the shadowlands, where we're only seeing through a veil of tears. And that's why, by the way, when I say the Salve Regina, the Hail Holy Queen, I say veil of tears and not valley of tears, not just to be awkward. But the word veil, of course, is a double entendre. V-A-L-E as in valley, but also V-E-I-L as in the veil that you wear. And we do not see the fullness of God's presence. We do not see the fullness of God's presence in each of us as individuals. We do not see that we're made in God's image because we're looking through a veil of tears. That the fullness of life beyond this shadowlands is in God's presence in heaven. That's when we become fully real. So for me, I mean, I'm not a theologian, for me, some of the deepest eschatological theology about the end times, is in a children's story. It's the last of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. If you haven't read it, and it's not just for children, of course, unless you become like little children, perhaps it is just for children, just become more childlike and read it again. But that book, The Last Battle, the last 30 or so pages, this depiction of heaven, where the further up and further in you go, the more glorious, the more beautiful, the more real that it is. And he uses a couple of metaphors. He says that heaven is like an onion in reverse. A bit of a strain. Heaven's like an onion. I bet you haven't heard that one before, have you? But when you peel away the outer skin of an onion, the onion gets smaller and smaller. What Lewis is saying is you peel away this onion, and every layer gets bigger and bigger forever and ever. And he also said that this life, it's the same children's story, that this life we're living is like the cover and the title page of a book. That the real story hasn't begun yet. And the story itself is a book where every chapter is better than the one before. That's what we should keep our eye on. So when we see evil, we should not respond with something which might lead us to not be charitable. I sometimes feel that the one place that we should not follow in the footsteps of Christ is in turning over the tables of the money changers at the temple. I'm pleased that he did it. Someone needed to do it. but if we follow in the footsteps of Christ's righteous anger, we're in danger of losing charity. It's very difficult for a human person to succumb to anger without losing charity. And if we've lost charity, even if we're saying the right things, we're on the wrong side. Because God is the God of love. And it's a very short step from anger to hatred. So these are, anyway, I know we live in very divisive times now, but then all times to one degree or another are divisive. But I just want all of us to remember that we are on active service for Christ, and our personal history is our own life. And our own life is only actually going to be rich if we know about the lives of others, not just the neighbors living next door, but the neighbors living yesterday. I'll give you another example of tradition. I mentioned Chesterton earlier, talking about being the extension of democracy through time, the proxy of the dead, the enfranchisement of the unborn. But Tolkien said in the 1960s there was a mania in the church, because the war against the devil also takes place with people in the church. The pattern was established with Judas Iscariot. That's sort of, about 8% of the church from the beginning, Judas's. So that's probably a pattern that's also continued for 2,000 years. But there was a mania within the church for getting back to the so-called purity of the early church. In other words, the golden age. Right? If you actually look at the early church from the time of Judas, but certainly the first and second century, the church was ripped apart by heresies, many of them which are very similar to the ones we have today. Some things never change. But the idea of the golden age, we need to get back to the purity of the early church. If we could just get back to that golden age, of the first 200 or 300 years of the church, everything would be wonderful. So all sorts of traditions of the church that have been built up over centuries were being thrown out. I heard a story at Gonzaga University when I was there they have a beautiful chapel on the campus of Gonzaga University. And it said, during this mania in the 60s, they had these beautiful hand-carved pews and beautiful stained glass windows. They literally threw the pews through the windows to get rid of that junk and get back to the purity of the early church. Well, Tolkien said, I don't know why a sapling is considered superior to the full-grown tree. And he said, even if the sapling were superior to the full-grown tree, if you chop down the tree looking for the sapling, you don't find the sapling, you kill the tree. So for us, again, as Chesterton says, that humanity is a strange creature that can only move forward by looking back. That we have to know our neighbors over the last 2,000 years. We have to know all the people that have contributed towards the growing of the tree. Because we can be enriched by them, we can become wise through them, most obviously, of course, the lives of the saints. But let me give you one quick example to finish with, because I haven't talked about God as the creator. So Pope Benedict says that the only arguments for the church are the saints and the great works of art that she's inspired. Well, the saints, we understand. The good, love. What about art? What about beauty? Well, the good, the true, and the beautiful, which the Greek philosophers sort of were doing a lot of thinking about. The good, the true, and the beautiful are triune. They're inseparable. You can't separate them. The good is always true and beautiful. The true is always good and beautiful. The beautiful is always true and good. It's an image of the Trinity. When Jesus Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he's saying, I am the good, the true, and the beautiful. Beauty is the life in things. And we have to be alive to see it. Now, I'm going to end by telling you a story. Once upon a time, all stories start that way. Or they should do. Once upon a time, there was a rock. And it was a really beautiful rock. But nobody had ever seen it. Then one day someone dug up the rock, and now people could see it. One or two people with eyes, humility, and eyes open in wonder, could see this is a beautiful rock. But one person who had better eyes than everybody else came and said, that's not a beautiful rock. That is the beautiful rock. And he took the rock away, did things to it. Today, if you go to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and you go through the doors to St. Peter's Basilica and turn immediately to the right, and the first side chapel on the right, you will see Michelangelo's Pieta, with the mother of Christ cradling her dead son. Everybody who sees that, unless they're Gollum, unless they're Homo Superbus, everybody with eyes to see, opened in wonder, prays. Even the atheist and the agnostic and the Jew and the Muslim. Let me explain. Because at a base level, the most rudimentary level, prayer is lifting up the mind and the heart to God. Everybody sees that, regardless of whether they understand who the mother of Christ is, and indeed who Christ is. The significance of the crucifixion. They will see because of seeing the beauty of the art and the perennial depiction of a mother's love for a son, the perennial depiction of death, and the love that transcends death, lifts up the heart and the mind to God. Even for the atheist, he's now moving his mind and heart in the right direction. The first steps. That's why also we have to be knowledgeable and immerse ourselves in the great works of beauty. God is not just omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. He's the creator. The Greek word for to create is poiesis, from where we get the word poet. God is the poet. This world is a poem. God is a storyteller. This world is a story. Tolkien has God create Middle-earth as the great music, God as the composer. C.S. Lewis has Aslan create Narnia by singing it into being. Beauty, as Dostoevsky says, will save the world. Yes, but only because beauty and Jesus Christ are ultimately the same thing. So to conclude, progress in society is measured by the number of progressives in society. So far, the Democrats would agree with that. So I didn't mean to bring politics in. Erase that last part. Certain self-styled progressives would agree with that. But the point is they don't understand what progress is. Progress is not worshipping a mythical golden age in the future which will bring murder and terror and tyranny and not the utopia they believe in. Progress is moving towards Christ. So every time someone moves towards Christ, society is progressing. We can't move the whole of society towards Christ. We're not meant to, so therefore it shouldn't worry us. We are meant to move ourselves towards Christ by the grace of God. We can't do it by ourselves. But by having a relationship with him, we move closer to him, and the only way we can move closer to him is to love the Lord our God and to love our neighbor. So insofar as we love our neighbor, we're bringing our neighbors closer to God. Human society is only truly progressive if it's progressing towards Christ. In that sense, all of us are called to be progressives, but we have to begin by making progress ourselves. So our personal history is our own personal life. Our place in history is our place in his story. Does our story lead us to him so that we can be with him forever, beyond history, in that other story, the best story of all, where we will live happily ever after? Thank you. I forgot to mention, by the way, Deacon Bickerstaff will be very annoyed with me if I don't do this. Is he still in here? Has he left? Oh, he's there. Okay. He'll be very annoyed if I don't mention. He told me to make sure I mention this. He said that by the power that he has in his ordained ministry, that everybody here is exempt from the virtues of temperance and prudence when they get within 5 yards of my book table. It's not a sin, and you won't have to confess it. You just spend what you can't afford and worry about it later, okay?
So, Joseph, thank you so much. And I believe you have time for some Q&A.
Of course, absolutely.
Because we're recording tonight, if you would raise your hand, I'd like to come to you with the mic and let you speak into the mic. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll come to you, and Joseph will answer your questions. Who would like to ask our speaker? Excuse me 1 second.
Hello. On the journey that we're on, we are soldiers on that journey, how are we doing?
How are we doing?
Yes.
Well, let's take as our model the 12 hand-picked apostles of Christ. Right? When things got really tough, one was a traitor, 10 ran away, and only one had the courage to stand by him at the cross. So how we're doing as individuals, I can't speak for your soul. How I'm doing is miserably. But obviously, you know, God he knows who we are. He knows our weaknesses. He knows that we're not just Homo viator and Anthropos, that we are also Homo Superbus. We are broken by sin. It's not that we have to be Homo viator or Homo Superbus, we're both. But the question is, in the war, because again, Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that there's a civil war going on in human society in every generation, and it takes place in the individual heart of every individual person. So it's your own civil war that you're fighting by the grace of God, because without his grace, the Homo Superbus will win. But that struggle between Homo viator and Homo Superbus is one we're all struggling, and it's only by the grace of God, especially through his sacraments, that we can triumph and get to be with God in heaven. The victory.
I think we have a follow-up.
When you get to the 21st chapter in your new book?
I'm going to finish my book at the end of the 20th century. For very, very simple reason, we're too close to the 21st century to make sense of it. I mean, you can't.
That goes back to what I said, how are we doing?
Oh, well, you know, I mean, if in one sense, there were some great saints in the 20th century, right? There were great saints in every century. There's also great evil in every century. There's division in society. There's division in the church in just about every century. So there's this pattern. And so what we have to understand is that the only thing that changes are things like, some things you'll say, well, we haven't had the internet before. We haven't had nuclear weapons before. We haven't had man-made viruses before. So obviously things are different. But these, in a philosophical sense, are accidental, not substantial. In other words, the key thing is the 7 deadly sins are still as deadly as they always were. The 7 virtues, the theological and cardinal virtues, are now as virtuous and life-giving now as they always were. So what we use as tools for good or evil, whether it be viruses, nuclear bombs, I'm not sure how you can use a nuclear bomb for good, but that's another matter. Whatever we have at our disposal as tools, because of technology, does not change this essential nature of the battle between good and evil.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Hey, go on, Larry, do. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned 3 encyclicals that we should read. Would you repeat what they are, please?
Yes, Rerum Novarum, and I'll spell it if any of you want to if anyone want to write it down. Actually, so maybe I'm going to. I'm not going to cough because that's illegal these days. I'm going to over here and hum a bit until you got your phones or your pens out. So Rerum Novarum, R-E-R-U-M. N-O, and then second word, N-O-V-A-R-U-M, Rerum Novarum, means on new things. And that's by Pope Leo XIII, 1891. Quadragesimo Anno, why did I say I was going to spell them? Q-U-A-D-R-I-S, I think just one S, I-M-O. And then that's the first word, and then anno, A-N-N-O, on the 40th anniversary of the early encyclical. That's by Pius XI, 1931. And then Centesimus Annus, C-E-N-T-I-S-I-M-U-S, I don't think there's 2 S's, Annus, A-N-N-U-S, and that's on the centenary of the 100th anniversary of, that's by John Paul II, St. John Paul II, 1991.
Other questions for Mr. Pearce? Yes, ma'am.
So in today's time, how can we recognize what's true, good, and beautiful when there's so much noise and it feels like everybody has varying opinions on what is true, good, and beautiful? Is it instinct? How do you recognize that?
Okay, great question. And there's more than one question in it. The first thing, I wrote something a few years back called distracting ourselves to death. So the first thing we have to do is not distract ourselves to death. And one way we can do that is to find silence and to unplug. Well, I'm not saying unplug altogether because most of us need to plug if they know what to earn a living these days. But we should be techno-minimalists. And should we say, creation maximalists, right? Unplug your computer and go and look at the sunset and look at the beauty of God's creation, beauty of art as a means of lifting you up. Now, how do we know the true? Well, the point is, let's get how to answer this very briefly. Relativism doesn't believe in the truth. Relativism merely believes that what you want to be true is true for you. Well, that's an opinion. It's not a truth. It's not the truth. And the consequence of that is misery for the person who believes it and for the people that love them. It doesn't bring goodness. It actually wrecks. Love is, let me very quickly. So if relativism is basically, it's all about me. Right? The relativistic trinity is not the good, the trinity, beautiful. It's me, myself, and I, okay? So if that's all it's about, well, what you need to engage with the good, love, see, again, the 2 meanings of the word love. For the relativist, love is a feeling, it's an emotion, and therefore it's irrational. And it comes and goes like the wind, right? But for a Christian, love is making a rational choice to freely choose to lay down your life in sacrifice for another. The 2 loves are as different as heaven and hell. And what that requires, of course, true love is objectivity, seeking something beyond yourself to give yourself to. Same thing with reason. To reason, you have to be looking at an object to see it. If you're basically saying it all comes from me, you're not looking at the object. Your eyes are closed with pride, not open in wonder. You can't reason without opening your eyes in wonder, whether it's science or whether it's any other engagement with reason. And then finally, the beautiful. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder, because the beholder could be blind or deaf. The beauty is in the thing beheld. And our ability to behold it depends upon how humble we are and whether we actually have eyes opened in wonder so that we can see. So in all of these things, the engagement with the good, the true, and the beautiful requires humility. And it's very appropriate, by the way, that the radical relativists have adopted the one word pride to encapsulate themselves, because it's the perfect label for themselves.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Difficult to answer that one in a few sentences, so thank you.
I don't think you were a cradle Catholic, correct?
I am a convert.
What hit you to go into Catholicism and study it the way you have?
Well, you know, I give a whole talk. Shall I give the whole talk now? We'll be here till midnight. I wrote a book called Race with the Devil, my journey from racial hatred to rational love, and I went to prison twice for hate crimes when I was young. So I hated the Catholic Church. I was involved with anti-Catholic terrorist organizations in Northern Ireland. So I've come a long way by the grace of God and only through the grace of God. But one reason was reason. Because I was always taught when I was growing up, you had to choose. You either had to be rational or religious. And if you choose to be religious, you're therefore choosing to be irrational. And it might make you feel good, and that might be good enough reason to do it, but it's not. Nonetheless, it's irrational. And it was first of all, through G.K. Chesterton, who showed me that fides et ratio, faith and reason, were actually indissolubly bonded in a marriage. That if you actually remove faith from reason, you end up with something irrational, such as Marxism, such as Nietzsche, such as all these crazy ideas that have killed so many millions of people. So, and of course, Chesterton was getting that from St. Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas was borrowing from Aristotle. So we have this whole history of engagement with the real through the use of reason, which leads to God, not away from him. So on the rational level, that was the path. I mean, there was a healing level going on and other things as well, but that was a crucial part of it.
Joseph, for those of us who have children or grandchildren who will have children or grandchildren one day, how would you advise us to impress upon them the powerful lessons from what you shared tonight?
To our children? Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, George Bernard Shaw, I think it was George Bernard Shaw, said something which is not true, but it's only true where children are concerned, or parenting is concerned, more to the point, it's not even true then, actually, but I'm going to say it because it's what I'm trying to answer your question. George Bernard Shaw said the only golden rule is there is no golden rule. And of course that's not true, because parenting, the golden rule is to love, to actually loving in the Christian sense, to lay down, sacrifice your lives for your children and teach them to do likewise. So that's the hub of it. But beyond that, every single family is as unique as every single human person. So apart from love, I know, because for instance, I mean, we have a son who has special needs, so he has his own relationship with us, and we have our own relationship with him. But our daughter, for instance, I mean, I have a daughter. I would love her to go and watch English soccer with me. She has the same attitude as her mother, that sports is a sort of male pathology. So that's not going to happen. So, she's now reading The Lord of the Rings by herself for the first time. I did read it to her when she was younger. So, but the point is, every person, both parent and child, is unique. So the key thing is, of course, to love. That means the good, the true, and the beautiful. Teach them to love. Teach them how to reason, that it's not what you feel that makes something true. It's what's true whether you feel it or not. And to appreciate beauty when they see it, in music, in art, in story. Follow Christ, the way, the truth, and the life, through the good, the true, and the beautiful. I mean, that's what we try to do, and I think that's as near as you can get to a golden rule, but some kids are going to be more interested in music than stories and etc. So, and that's the real art of parenting is that you only sort of get the hang of it maybe if you have 9 kids. Most of us don't have 9 kids, which means we don't have the hang of it, you know.
Thank you, thank you. Any other questions for Professor Pearce? Yes, Mary.
I have a question. Excuse me, I just wanted to know what you would think of this. I was speaking to someone who was telling me her frustration in trying to help another person learn to sing a certain harmony in a song. And I don't know if the other person was tone deaf or what the frustration was, but she went on and on about how she worked so hard to help her. I worked so hard to help her. Now, I don't think she was saying this to make herself look good. She was genuinely frustrated. And I said, well, you know, I said, sometimes God puts people in our path to teach us patience and charity. And she did not take a breath. And she said, oh, my God isn't like that.
Well, I don't know which God she's worshipping then. It's her own, obviously. So.
And I, I was at a loss for words.
Well, the thing is, obviously, I can't comment upon. I don't know her, but this does bring in that. Randy edited a book, Special Needs,
Special Children, Blessed Fathers. Special Children, Blessed Fathers.
Special Children, Blessed Fathers. But I think this what came to mind when you were saying this, particularly when you said that God sends us people to try our patience, challenge us. You know, I have a son, 19 years old now, who has Down syndrome and autism. And someone said something really profound to me that was life-changing. And they said that most of us are here to learn, but some of us are here to teach, and children with Down syndrome are here to teach. So when we find ourselves challenged by somebody, in whatever way, right, and there'll be many ways we can be challenged by other people, that we should see that this is a means by which we are being taught. That person is not meaning to be a teacher, but they are nonetheless teaching us. And so that I think is the lesson that we need to be learning. And people that make us angry, people that frustrate us, it's a call to patience, it's a call to love. You know, we can all love people that make us feel good. Even the Pharisees do that.
One last question, and then Joseph is going to come over to the book table. He's got some books for sale. Our volunteer, John Gordon, will be glad to help you. He'll sign books. But let's do one last question. Sir, here you go.
Also, the magazine he mentioned, I edit's over there if you want to check it out.
You talked about a pattern. You talk about division that happens, and I take it that you mean it's cyclical, that we go through these things. You were using every century, but I'm sure it's not exactly every century. But what is it that brings us together? If we're going through a division, or are we just continually subdividing and subdividing out of existence?
Well, no, I think that throughout the whole of history, I wouldn't call it cyclical, because that's not true. We are moving forward. I mean, time doesn't move backwards, it moves in one direction, right? But there's a tapestry, there's a pattern, there's a fabric to human history. And those three dimensions of the good, the bad, and the beautiful, the bad is what divides us, and the good is what unites us. So insofar as we accentuate that strand of goodness by becoming saints ourselves, we will be helping to unite people to each other and to Christ. Insofar as we succumb in the civil war in our hearts to the dark side, we will be causing division. And so there's always going to be division in every society because we're not going to persuade everybody to become a saint. It hasn't happened, it's not going to happen, and when the final curtain comes down, there'll be sheep and goats, we know that. So this pattern that we're seeing in human history will be the pattern until the consummation of things. But it's not the pattern in heaven. The pattern in heaven is nothing but goodness and beauty. And it's not the pattern in hell where there's nothing but the bad and there's no goodness and beauty.
Everyone, thank you for coming tonight. Our next event is October 12th with Father Paul Porter. Hope you'll join us. There will be email announcements coming out about that. If you'd like to join Joseph Pearce at the book signing table and check out his books and magazines, please do. Otherwise, have a great night. God bless you all. Thank you very much. And I'd like to close this in prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, we're just grateful for this opportunity to come together as Catholic men and women to hear this wonderful speaker tonight. We ask that you please bless us, bless all the people here tonight, bless our parish, bless our church, bless everyone on the prayer list at Blessed Trinity and St. Peter Chanel. Please bless Joseph Pearce as he continues his work of evangelizing and sharing the faith. And we ask that everyone here tonight be the light of Christ to all that they encounter. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Thank you and good night.